annual mock trial organised by the lawyers group of Classics for All, held as usual in the Supreme Court. So I welcome everyone here and the much larger number of people who are watching us online from home. The defendant this year is Alexander the Great, and here he is. Alexander, and the judge I should add, is Lord Leggatt. Alexander the Great had a good start in life. His father was Philip of Macedon, the warrior king who conquered and united the whole of Greece. His teacher was Aristotle, the greatest polymath of the ancient world. Alexander here came to the throne at the age of 20. He didn't need to wait until he was 73. He embarked upon spectacular military campaigns. His principal foe was the mighty Persian Empire, which, against all the odds, he soundly defeated. From there, Alexander went on to storm through Central Asia and invade and conquer large parts of northern India and Pakistan. Finally, he returned to Babylon, where he died at the age of 32. What a life, you may say. He was buried in Egypt at Alexandria, one of the many cities which he founded. The events which are the subject of this trial occurred in the winter of 331 to 330 BC. That was when Alexander and his army captured and occupied Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. Alexander stands trial tonight on 4 counts. I think you all have copies of the indictment in front of you. And those who are watching from home have hopefully downloaded it from the website. Count 1 charges Alexander with ransacking Persepolis. Count 2, massacring Persian civilians. Count 3, enslaving en masse Persian women. And count 4 was the offence of destroying the ancient royal palace of Persepolis, a cultural heritage site. So those are the 4 charges which Alexander faces. He pleaded not guilty at a plea and directions hearing last week, and tonight it will be for you, the jury, to decide whether or not he is guilty on each of those 4 counts. The trial will now start.
Court all rise.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Supreme Court, whether you're here in person or watching online. As you may know, before this building became the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, it used to be a court in which criminal trials took place as a Crown Court, and before that as a venue for quarter sessions. And this is the night of the year when this court reverts to its former function as a criminal court. Last year it did so when Queen Boudica stood trial here for offences, accused of offences under the Terrorism Act, for leading an uprising against the Roman state. Tonight we are sitting as an international criminal court in support of Classics for All, trying Alexander III, King of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, for war crimes. Alexander, as you know, sits over there in the dock. He is prosecuted by Philippe Sands QC and John Goss, defended by Patrick Gibbs QC and Ailsa Williamson, I understand that they are this evening acting pro bono, as Alexander's spoils from his campaigns have long since been dissipated. I am presiding over the trial as the judge, and the audience present here are the jury. The prosecution and defence will each have 30 minutes to present their case. I'm sure that they will keep, without the need for any intervention, to their time limits, but if need be, the court will enforce those limits. I will then give a short summing up, and you, the jury, will be asked to give your verdicts. There will in this trial be no evidence. I understand that most of the facts are not in dispute, but where there is any dispute of fact, it will be for you, the jury, to give the assertions of counsel such weight as you think fit. As for the law, it is common ground, I understand, that the relevant events took place in the course of an international armed conflict, and that the applicable law is therefore what used to be called the laws of war, and today is usually referred to as international humanitarian law. But it will, I anticipate, be an issue much in dispute, and that you will need to consider when you come to decide the case, whether Alexander should be judged by the customs and standards of his own time, living as he did some 2,400 years ago, or by the standards of today. As you know, there are 4 counts on the indictment. I will not read the counts, but as you've also been told, to each of them, the defendant has pleaded not guilty, and it will be for you to say, having heard the prosecution and defence, whether he be guilty or not on each count. So I'll invite now Mr. Sands QC to present the case for the prosecution.
Thank you, my Lord, and may I begin by expressing my regret that I will be speaking to you today with my back turned to you. The last time I'm aware that happened was when Mr. Hans Frank appeared in courtroom 600 and mistakenly turned his back to the court. Alexander the Great, former king of Macedon, is a former head of state, and we will therefore refer to him simply as Mr. the Great. Mr. the Great faces 4 charges of war crimes. They all arise out of the destruction of Persepolis in the winter of 331-330 BCE. The facts are set out in the indictment, and in exercise of universal jurisdiction, it is not in dispute that this court plainly has jurisdiction to prosecute Mr. the Great for crimes that are violations of the laws and customs of war. It's also common ground between the parties that Mr. the Great is not entitled to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of this court. The absence of immunity for a former head of state is established by the decision of this court in its Pinochet number 3 in March 1999. So the essential issue, the fundamental issue, I would say, is whether this court has jurisdiction to convict Mr. the Great when it will no doubt be argued by my learned friends that the laws of customs of war in his time, 2,500 years ago, were very different from what they are now. My Lord, there is also a secondary issue of fact on count 4 on the issue of Mr. the Great's intention, which my learned junior, Mr. Goss, will address, and Miss Williamson, I believe, also will be addressing. So I make 3 main points and submissions on these matters. First, the prohibition of war crimes is a matter of universal application. We know from current media that the destruction of cities is, very regrettably, a current story still today, 2,500 years after Persepolis. We see it on our own screens, we see it in our newspapers, but we must remember it is Mr. the Great who is on trial today, not Mr. Putin. What the classics teach us is that what happened then is as relevant today as it ever was. I I can begin by taking you back to the summer of 1946 and courtroom 600 of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. Sir Geoffrey Lawrence presided, sat with 3 other judges. They had before them the report of the Extraordinary State Commission of the Soviet Union, presented to the Nuremberg Tribunal as exhibit number USSR number 47. And it said, before their retreat from Mariupol, the German occupational authorities burned down all the 68 schools of the city, 17 kindergarten schools, and they destroyed the Palace of the Pioneers. This is not a new issue that we face today. There is jurisprudence bang on point. And back then too, in 1946, it was said that the tribunal did not have jurisdiction. The defendants and their counsel invoked that very notion in their submissions. It is one we find reflected in poetry. I draw your attention, my lord, to the poem by Louis MacNeice, which treated, written in 1938, the matter of ancient slavery. And I quote, "It was all so unimaginably different and all so long ago." Of course, it wasn't so different. As he was writing in August 1938, the world was sliding into war with an expansionist empire that had no qualms about slavery or, as we've heard, the destruction of cities. And in the wake of that war, the nations of the world united not only to condemn wars of aggression politically, but also legally. They had to decide what laws to apply and what crimes to punish. They'd settled on war crimes, on crimes against humanity, on genocide, and on aggression. But all of these crimes did not pre-exist in a written and codified form in 1939, when these events happened. This was, in effect, a wholly new enterprise. It had never happened before as a matter of practice. And so against that background, the British prosecution entrusted to the Professor of International Law at Cambridge University, Hersch Lauterpacht, the task of addressing this vital temporal issue. And it was he who wrote the opening speech for Sir Hartley Shawcross, the British prosecutor, dealing with exactly the issue we are dealing today. Let me read to you what Professor Lauterpacht wrote. "There is," these are his words, "all the difference between saying to a man, 'You will now be punished for an act which was not a crime at the time you committed it,' on the one hand, and telling him, 'You will now pay the penalty for conduct which was contrary to law and a crime when you executed it, though, owing to the imperfection of the international machinery, there was at that time no court competent to pronounce judgment against you.'" And Lauterpacht goes on, "If that be retroactivity, we proclaim it to be most fully consistent with that higher justice, which in the practice of civilized nations has set a definite limit to the retroactive operation of the laws. Let the defendants and their protagonists complain that the Charter of Nuremberg is in this, as in other matters, an ex parte fiat of the victor. These victors, composing as they do the overwhelming majority of the nations of the world, represent also the world's sense of justice, which would be outraged if the crime of war after this Second World War," he was speaking in 1946, "were to remain unpunished. In thus interpreting, declaring, and supplementing the existing law, they are content to be judged by the verdict of history." And Lauterpacht ends with a Latin maxim, taken from St. Augustine, "Securus judicat orbis terrarum." The verdict of the world is conclusive. Thus it was argued in 1946. The argument of retroactivity failed back then, and no doubt it will be argued again today, and once again, it must fail. To be clear, Professor Lauterpacht was writing about the crime of waging a war of aggression. By then, it was common ground that by the time Louis MacNeice was writing, the destruction of cities, the murder of civilians, and the enslavement of women in war was prohibited as a war crime. But you can apply exactly the same principle to this gentleman, Mr. the Great. It was simply that there was no mechanism back then in 330 BCE to punish what was already recognized as the infliction of unnecessary suffering and pain. Even less so when those were the acts of the victors, as Mr. the Great's acts were. But my lord, this court today can apply the world's sense of justice and ensure that this crime no longer remains unpunished. The verdict of the world is conclusive today as it was back in 1946. For you, my lord, and for members of the jury to rule otherwise would be to turn the clock back. It would be to undermine and to undo a principle of universal jurisdiction across all time and all place. I turn to my second point. There is no military justification for the acts set out in counts 1 to 3. It is entirely clear, we say, that the sack of Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire, the pride of the Persians, the wealthiest city under the sun, with private houses filled for a long time with riches of every kind, as Diodorus Siculus told us, was against the law. It had no military justification whatsoever. And let me explain why. The Persian Empire had already been substantially defeated over a 3-year campaign. It had lost its territories in what we now call Turkey, the Levant, Egypt, and Iraq. And following Gaugamela, Darius III, the last of the Achaemenid kings, fled into the mountains with only a tiny remnant of his army. That deals with indictment paragraph 1. Mr. the Great, my second point, had already accepted the peaceful surrender of other substantial Persian cities, Babylon and Susa. Persepolis had offered its full cooperation to the invading forces following the defeat of the forces sent out to defend it. And militarily, there was no reason whatsoever, none, for Persepolis to be destroyed. Politically, the Persian Empire was in tatters. The capture of the city was more than enough by way of propaganda to justify a victory on behalf of Mr. the Great. In terms of motive, he has said himself, we have it in the indictment, paragraph 4, it was an act of revenge, pure and simple. He was, as he put it, simply revisiting the crimes of previous generations, not on their sons, but on their great, 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 great grandchildren. 150 years later. That is not military necessity. I turn to my third and final point. The standards of the time do not help Mr. the Great, because even by those standards, Alexander would have known that the wanton destruction of cities was unacceptable. And I turn to one of the great books written on this matter by Hersch Lauterpacht, An International Bill of the Rights of Man, in which he traverses the history in which these fundamental precepts of humanity, looking after human beings, emerged. And he goes back to the classical period. He goes back to the Greeks, and he goes back to the Romans. And he writes, for example, at page 18, although Plato distrusted democratic rule, in the Politicus he made Protagoras pronounce a most striking defense of democracy. While men differ in their aptitude for arts and professions, they have all been assigned a share of justice and fairness which are necessary for the art of government. The anguished defense which Sophocles put into the mouth of Antigone has often and justly been quoted in this connection. She may have transgressed Creon's decree, but she did not overstep the law of Zeus or the eternal precepts of justice. This, writes Lauterpacht in 1945, in essence, is the assertion that the individual is governed by a rule of conduct superior to the arbitrary decrees of the earthly authority. And that goes back to 330 BCE. there are many classical examples to support the proposition that the destruction of cities was not simply part and parcel of ancient warfare. To be sure, it was on occasion controversial, even maybe common, but it was never justified as such. I could take you through the many examples, but I don't have time. Euripides' Trojan women telling the story of the sack of Troy. Plato in the Republic discussing the perfect state and writing on the limits to be placed on war. And Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil and unbelievably Mr. the Great's personal tutor, wrote that war always had to be justified ethically and should always be fought for the sake of peace, not for its own ends, not for revenge. Allow me to conclude. The prohibition of war crimes was plainly already a part of the law, international and other, in 330 BCE. Even by the standards of that time, there was no military justification for the acts listed in counts 1 to 3. That is recorded in contemporaneous evidence. And the principle of military necessity is, like the related principle of proportionality, an essential component of international humanitarian law to which my Lord referred. And so it has been since time immemorial. The principle of military necessity permits measures which are actually necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose and are not otherwise prohibited by international humanitarian law. In the case of an international armed conflict, the only legitimate military purpose is to weaken the military capacity of the other parties to the conflict. Revenge is not military necessity. Mayhem is not military necessity. And so, on the 3 counts, let me conclude. On count 1, the order to the Macedonian army to pillage and destroy the city of Persepolis was not justified by military necessity. On count 2, the order to the Macedonian army to kill en masse those Persian civilians present in the city of Persepolis was not justified by military necessity. And on count 3, the order of the Macedonian army to enslave en masse the female Persian civilians present in the city of Persepolis was not justified by military necessity. All of these acts were war crimes. And I could go further, my Lord, but I don't need to. They were also crimes against humanity because they were systematic. And I could go even further and say that some of the acts were genocidal, even if they occurred 2,500 years before the concept of genocide was invented. We now have a recent authority to support the proposition that the crime of genocide applies to acts that occurred even before the concept was invented by Mr. Lemkin. The recognition by Germany of its treatment of the Herero population in Southwest Africa in 1908 has last year been recognized by Germany as a crime of genocide. And so there is no temporal issue. With that I close, and I hand over to my learned junior, who will deal with count 4. Unless, my Lord, I can assist you any further, I will take my seat.
My Lord and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I will be dealing with count 4 on the indictment, which relates to the burning of the palace at Persepolis, some months after the sack of the city, the murder of its male inhabitants and the enslavement of its women, that forms the subject of counts 1 to 3. It's a count that raises 2 issues. The first is the standards of the time, on which my learned leader has already addressed you. But the second is Mr. the Great's intent. Was this part of a foolish, drunken act youthful vandalism writ large, although since he was 25 at this point, you might think that the benefit of that argument was fading somewhat? Or was it a political act of deliberate destruction of a historic monument and a cultural site of enormous significance? If it was the former, then we don't invite this court to convict. It is at worst a domestic crime, a matter for the Macedonian Magistrates' Court. But if the latter, if this was a deliberate destruction of cultural property, then that engages this court's universal jurisdiction over war crimes, because the destruction of cultural property is an attack on the cultural heritage of all mankind. And so this turns entirely on your findings of fact about his intent. For completeness, I add that there is no suggestion that the destruction of the palace had any military purpose whatsoever. Persepolis, by this point, had been secure for months. The Macedonian army had used it to overwinter. This was either mere wanton vandalism, or, and we say it is this, or the destruction of cultural heritage that you are entitled to convict in respect of. And I have 3 points for why you should conclude that it is such an attack and not mere vandalism. The first, the archaeological evidence. There is no dispute but that the city, the palace, was burnt. A 3-foot deep layer of ash found during the excavations of the palace makes that utterly beyond dispute. What was not found in the archaeological excavations was any trace of gold or silver or other treasures or precious metals. That, we say, is far more consistent with a premeditated, deliberate attack, a deliberate decision to destroy, rather than a spontaneous decision at the tail end of a drunken party. My second point is bad character. Alexander, Mr. the Great, is someone with a propensity for destroying sites out of revenge for what happened long, long ago, where there was no military necessity. And for evidence of that, I can point simply to counts 1 to 3, where he doesn't suggest this was simply done in drink. It's acknowledged that that was an act of state. And we say that you can look at those, and you can look at this, and you can say those are so similar that one must think, well, he's the sort of person who'd do that. And then the third point, and the one on which I will spend a little more time, is the ancient sources themselves. The best of them, we say, support the account that the destruction of the palace was all part and parcel, a continuation of the destruction of the city. A single course of conduct, all done deliberately for the same political ends, despite the offered surrender of the city. And for this, we put weight on the account of Arrian. Arrian, a Roman historian, but writing in Greek, admittedly 500 years or so after the events that took place, but he records specific details of the deliberations that took place with Alexander about the burning of the palace. He records Alexander's trusted advisor, Parmenio, saying to him, "Don't burn it, it's your property now, and if you burn it, all you will be doing is alienating the Persians, who will see you as coming not as a new king, but as nothing more than a conqueror." That is wise counsel, we suggest, from Parmenio, entirely in keeping with the wise counsel he had offered Alexander throughout his life. It's also entirely consistent with Alexander's somewhat impetuous nature to ignore the wise counsel of Parmenio, a man he later had assassinated. But we say that that advice, those deliberations, those sorts of factors being thought about, we say that has the ring of truth, and that you can put weight on that. Now, my learned friend may say, well, Arrian, that's all very well, but he's basing what he wrote on Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. And Ptolemy had a particular incentive, as you will see in the note that set out dealing with this count, not to blame Thias. Thias, the courtesan who they say inspired the drunken vandalism, which is their explanation for how the palace came to be burned. Well, Ptolemy was not Arrian's only source. Arrian was clearly aware, because he refers to them, of the other more tabloid sources about Alexander's life. And the best, the only one of those tabloid sources, Clitarchus, who mentions Thias and gives that as an explanation, spent time himself at the court of Ptolemy. And who's to say that he didn't himself have some sort of grudge or bias or motive for getting back at her? It's worth spending a little more time on Clitarchus and thinking about how reliable he really is. He's a man who the lawyer and the advocate, the author of the Institutes of Oratory, Quintilian, described as having more ability than trustworthiness. Cicero himself accused Clitarchus of indulging in little more than petty fictions. And even Plutarch, who, drawing on Clitarchus, faithfully records that story of Thias and the drunken vandalism, says this is the way the deed was done, according to some writers, but others say it was premeditated. And we say that premeditated makes much more sense, it's consistent with his character, it's consistent with the archaeology, and you can reject the tabloid story of drunken misbehaviour inspired by Thias as something dropped in to titillate the reader by Clitarchus, or to settle some long-standing grudge against a powerful woman at court. And taking all those strands together, we submit that you can be sure that Alexander's decision to burn the palace was a deliberate political act aimed at the destruction of cultural heritage, and you can reject his opportunistic reliance on Clitarchus' titillating story. And so we invite you to convict on count 4. Members of the jury, my lord, unless I can assist any further.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Gibbs.
I want to say something about evidence and context and example and greatness and practical reality. And between us, Miss Williamson and I will, of course, answer the prosecution's allegations one by one. But may I begin with the elephant in the room? We all thought, didn't we, when we came into this grand chamber, that we knew what a war criminal looked like? The difficulty is not in recognizing them, it's in catching them. We have a list to remind us. The list's fairly short, but it's dark and it's intense. From Nuremberg, Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Bormann. From Rwanda, Akayesu, Kambanda. From Yugoslavia, Milosevic, Mladic, Karadzic. And to that roll call of shame, the prosecution invite us to add the bonny name of Alexander the Great. Really? Mr. Sands and Mr. Gossmaker, clever case, all credit to them. But might we, as the jury, not be in danger of committing a fairly basic crime ourselves, the crime of anachronism? of applying modern notions and sensibilities and conventions and expectations to ancient norms of behavior which we struggle to understand and which, at a distance of 2,353 years, we feel no natural empathy. That list of Nazis and genocides were all tried after 1945 by reference to principles drawn up, I suggest, in 1945 and now embodied in the International Criminal Court, an institution established itself only 20 years ago. More than 23 centuries after Alexander, a hero in his own time, was dead and buried. And on the basis of what evidence do today's prosecutors seek to dig him up and parade him in cuffs before this court? The evidence of eyewitnesses, you might assume. Nothing less surely would be admissible or reliable or any sort of fair foundation for so grave a finding. That was what Nuremberg demanded. That was what the Rwandan tribunal demanded. That was the minimum requirement for Milosevic and Mladic and Karadzic. But who are the prosecution's witnesses in this case? The historians on whom the prosecution relies. And what do they know, you will want to ask, by their own eyes and ears of what in fact happened that day in 331 BC in central Iran? Is the answer nothing? They saw nothing. They heard nothing. They themselves know nothing. Where was Diodorus Siculus in 331 BC? He was 250 years unborn. Quintus Curtius Rufus, 400 years unborn. Plutarch, 430. Arrian, 480 years yet to be born. Had they spoken to anyone who was there, or the child of anyone who was there, or the great-great-grandchild of anyone who was there? They had not. They'd read books, they say. Books written by people who had spoken to people who may have been there. So you'll ask, where are the books now? May we inspect them? They've been lost, says the prosecution. It's an ancient excuse. Canis edit meos libellos. You'll ask, being a fair-minded and inquisitive jury, well, to the historians, did you at least cross-question the people who wrote these lost books? Did you try to work out what prejudices and preconceptions and personal and public motivations those book writers might have had? No, we didn't actually, seems to be the answer. Really, you might say? Well, may we at least cross-examine you, the prosecution's historians, to see what biases, conscious and unconscious, what agendas, public and private, may have influenced you to include in your Roman books, in your Roman times, the selections and the glosses of what you say you read in these lost Greek books. Well, may we? It seems not. No evidence, apparently. You've taken an oath, faithfully to try this long-dead king who cannot answer for himself and to return true verdicts. You'll be told by his lordship where the burden lies of proving the allegations and the standard to which they must be proven. The burden's on the prosecution, who've chosen to bring these charges. The standard they must satisfy is to make you sure, beyond reasonable doubt, we used to say. And that will be measured, you may think, against the morals and realities of the time. How else to be fair to the accused man? Next, context. Context matters, you may think. What was the immediate context for the indicted events in Persepolis? What had happened immediately before Alexander and his army entered the city, which might be relevant to your deliberations? I suggest two things: a battle and an outrage. The battle was the Battle of the Persian Gate, a hard-won victory. The Greek army moving east into Iran, as we would now call it, ambushed in a high, narrow pass, many of them killed and wounded, a tight-run thing. The fighting lasted several days as the Greeks tried to get over the mountains, only succeeding in a mirror image of Thermopylae when a local turncoat showed them a back route to outflank the Persian forces, who then fell back to Persepolis. And so the exhausted Greek army, fresh from that battle, crossed the mountains, makes its way towards Persepolis. Says the indictment, the city subsequently offered its cooperation to the defendant. Pause there. That's a nasty subsequently. It's a subsequently which omits a relevant detail, you may think. The Persian forces from the mountains reformed under the city walls, turned and forced the Greek army to fight again and win again before they could enter. And so those Greek soldiers, 3 years on campaign, thousands of their comrades and countrymen dead on the march behind them, came into the city of the enemy, bloody from combat, with their fighting heads on. How merciful did they feel? How easy was it? How easy could it have been for their commanders to control those men, to keep them from the wine and the honey? This was an army perfectly entitled by the standards of the day, as well it knew, to take for itself all the possessions of the defeated enemy. That's how any army, for centuries before and afterwards, would have expected to be rewarded for their loyal and dangerous service. War in the ancient world was, as we all know as classicists, a zero-sum game. What else was on their minds as they entered the city? The city which, to them, and I quote, was the most hateful city in the world. Confronted there by the embodiment of all that they'd been fighting against for the last 200 years, the answer is an outrage. A pitiful band of cripples emerges from the gates as they move to enter. Who are they? They're 800 elderly men and women, Greeks, who've been taken prisoner over the last century and subjected to torture by their Persian captors. I quote, "They looked more like outlandish phantoms than men, with no recognizably human characteristic apart from their voices. They cried out to Alexander gratefully, exclaiming that Jupiter, avenger of the Greeks, had sent him to deliver them. Alexander instantly promised to each of them 1,000 denarii and passage back to Greece. They answered that they could not return to Greece as monsters." Why monsters? Because they'd been branded and mutilated to prevent their escape. Feet cut off, hands, noses, ears. Old men and women, civilians, tortured by the citizens of Persepolis. Put it in context. How much harder now for the Greek army entering Persepolis to manage its emotions? And then, in every building, public and private, into which they go within the city, they find what? The spoils of Greece, things valuable and sentimental, and which had been looted and plundered from Greek homes and temples in the decades of Persian aggression that preceded this moment. It would be no surprise, would it, if some bloody work followed? And would it have been possible to prevent that? Would any of this have been as surprising then as it is to us now. One could take a contemporary example and think, how appalling! Put him in the dock. But at the time, measure these events perhaps against two examples, one before, one afterwards, bracket Persepolis. Both noble examples at the time. First, Homer. What example did the heroes of the Homeric epics set for this scenario? When the Trojans took the great wooden horse inside their city and the Greek sails crept back over the horizon under cover of dark, bringing their doom. Troy, just like Persepolis, was sacked by a Greek army. The possessions and valuables of the citizen population expropriated, the city set on fire, the women enslaved. Hecuba to Odysseus, Cassandra to Agamemnon, Andromache to Achilles' son. The list goes on. That was the great example set in heroic literature. And after the event, Rome. And not the vain and decadent era of the Caesars which would follow, but during the Republic, the great Roman Republic. What example does Rome give you, in its treatment of its greatest rival, Carthage? Fast forward 200 years from this indictment. Carthage is no longer a military threat. It's lost the Second Punic War. But it's rich. And it's still a powerful idea. And it's essentially inimical to Rome, just as Persepolis had been to Athens. That's why Cato never tired of reminding the Senate, Carthago delenda est. And he was right. If Rome was to be safe, Carthage had to be destroyed. And so, in 146 BC, in a third war, Carthage was razed to the ground and its entire population sold into slavery. And this is in the great days of the Roman Republic. The Republic, by reference to whose ideals the Western political world has set its watch ever since. Of course, it was a brutal piece of realpolitik, but only an anachronist would claim that it was a war crime. Enough of context. What about the defendant and his reputation? This man, we suggest, in the true sense of the word, is a hero. He's a great man. What that means is presently laid out in splendid detail in the British Library and can be examined at your leisure between now and February next year. And that great is no idle title. I didn't jump up when the reference to Mr. Great began. You will have known what to make of that. Great is an accolade accorded by history to this man on the basis of observed behavior, of repeated and settled and reliable ways of being and leading and governing, in the same way that Ethelred was unready, not once, not twice, but continually lacking in good counsel throughout his long reign. In the same way that Vlad III was an impaler not of the occasional deserving wretch, but of all and sundry. And Charles VI was properly mad. And Ivan was really, really terrible. So Alexander III of Macedon would have been known as just that, wouldn't he? The Third. And swiftly forgotten if he had not proved himself in word and deed, day in, day out, for 32 grueling years, to be truly great. Judged by his courage and his leadership and his far-sighted governance, we suggest, but you decide because it's your decision, he sits comfortably alongside history's other undisputed greats, Charlemagne, Constantine, our own Alfred, In fact, one could mount a formidable case, given time, for the proposition that he was the greatest of all of those, an unsurpassed exponent of both hard and soft power at an extraordinarily young age. As a military commander, you know these stories, so I don't need to go into detail. As a military commander, he seems to have triumphed almost invariably against near insuperable odds. Chironeia, he's 18, he's leading the cavalry in his father's army. He puts to rout the sacred band of Thebes, never previously defeated. The river Granicus, he's 22 now, and he's king commander. Leading the cavalry, he routs the Persians and their lackeys. At Issus, aged 23, having sliced the Gordian knot tied by King Midas, he meets Darius in pitched battle and drives him from the field. Gaugamela, he's 25, having besieged Tyre, conquered modern-day Syria and Lebanon and Israel, and liberated Egypt from the Persian yoke. He crosses the Euphrates and the Tigris, and again he drives Darius from the field. The Persian Gate, I've described it already, he's 26. And the last of the great battles is fought on the river border between what might now be Pakistan and India, and he defeats the Indian king and accepts him as his vassal, by which time he has killed the assassins who have murdered Darius and given Darius a royal burial, fought his way through and conquered Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Now he's 30 and he's in Pakistan. But he's not just a brilliant military commander, you may think. Again, you know these stories, I suspect. His tactics, still studied today in military academies all around the world. In his entourage, they're not just soldiers. He has engineers, architects, scientists, historians. He spreads Hellenistic culture across Western and Central Asia. He establishes a common currency and a trade zone from Gibraltar to the Punjab. He secures the Western world, in effect. I challenge anyone to contradict it. He secures the Western world against Eastern invasion for centuries. And he's more than a great Macedonian or a great Greek. He's, in effect, a multiculturalist. He's say the Egyptian sources, a natural fit as pharaoh. Say the Babylonian sources, everything they would expect from a Babylonian king. In Persia, he deftly makes 2 political marriages. In Afghanistan, he marries another princess, a Bactrian princess. He understands perfectly, doesn't he, notwithstanding his extreme youth, the need to intermingle the different cultures if he is to establish a legitimized line of authority for future stability. And perhaps that's no surprise. If Aristotle's your private tutor, you'd expect to be 15 love up. Although, as we all recognize today, an expensive education is no guarantee of probity or competence. But in Alexander, it was both. His lifetime guides are Homer and Aristotle. Aristotle, enough has been said, the fount and origin of Western political ethical thought, his tutor. He would have had the Nicomachean ethics dinned into him, and a great-souled man is exactly what he became. But for role models, he's given Homer. Homer's everywhere in Greece. Even the illiterate heard the Iliad sung or knew the stories by word of mouth. Alexander slept with a copy under his pillow, like a prayer book. And what is the Iliad? It's a dictionary of heroism, isn't it? Describing in exhaustingly beautiful verse, in a way that perhaps hasn't been bettered in 2,700 years, the bloody reality of patriotic war. It celebrates valor and brutality, mercy and cruelty. It takes as read that no quarter will be given, that the winner will take all, that the conquered will be slain, that men and women alike will be enslaved, that captives may be sacrificed even to honor the gods and the fallen. And its greatest hero is Achilles. No higher accolade could have been paid, could it, to any Greek soldier than to compare him with Achilles. Not because he looks like Brad Pitt in the film, but because he epitomized the virtues of a warrior king. So Achilles slaughters countless Trojans in battles and is admired for it, and is awarded as his slave the most beautiful of the Trojan widows, Briseis. And that's thought no odder than giving him a new team of horses for his chariot. He refuses to fight on when Agamemnon takes that slave for his own pleasures, and the reader of the time is outraged at the injustice done, not to the slave, but to Achilles. Achilles is the magnetic north to which Alexander's compass, and the compass of every other Greek in that army, was set. The example of Troy, you may think, would have been everywhere. Granicus on the river is fought near Troy. Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles as he moved south with his army after the battle. And who were Alexander's equivalents of the Trojans? They were the current and very real enemies of Greece, the existential enemies of Europe, the invaders, the menace that meant that no Greek city could ever sleep soundly, the Persians, the dark side, the Sith. And the reason for Philip and then Alexander wanting to conquer the Achaemenid Empire was pressing and obvious, wasn't it? To lead the Greeks in a war of liberation which would free them forever from Persian control and protect their cities in Anatolia and Cyprus and prevent any repetition of the two devastating Persian invasions of Greece. Darius I in 492, burning island after island, enslaving the citizens until driven back at Marathon. Xerxes I, his son, in 480 BC, looking to finish the father's job, burning the villages, the cities, the temples, until defeated at Salamis and Plataea. And of all the temples burned, one in particular, the Parthenon, the great temple of Athens, the greatest symbol of Greek religion and culture. And its equivalent in Persia, the equivalent of the Parthenon, Persepolis, the symbol of Persian domination, a monument to Darius and Xerxes and their conquests, the embodiment in wood and stone of everything that had tormented Greece for 150 years. To neutralize Persepolis would have established, wouldn't it, with symbolic as well as practical certainty that all of that was now at an end. And so there was, no doubt, an element of revenge in play in the minds of individual soldiers, revenge for the treatment of Athens, revenge for the Greeks taken captive and enslaved, for those executed, for the decades of cities attacked and land grabbed and the lives lost at Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea and Marathon and Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela and the Persian Gate. But the symbolic power of drawing a line under Persepolis was perhaps more important still, you will think. Just as at Troy, just as at Carthage.
Mr. Gibbs, you'll have to come to your peroration shortly because your junior needs some time.
Yes. Let's turn to the indictment and deal with each of the counts. The defence to each count in outline, as you will now see, as we put it, is this. Count 1. Persepolis and its contents were Alexander's as conqueror. The citizens of Persepolis would have known in this zero-sum game that in defeat, all their possessions were forfeit. It's not lawful, it never was, to destroy your own property. As a symbol, Persepolis, I submit, needed to be crushed, not just in revenge for the equivalent in Greece, but as a full stop below 160 years of debilitating warfare. And this destruction of, no doubt, much that was beautiful, was also for centuries the guarantee of European civilization. Count 2. Did Alexander order the killing of the civilians in Persepolis? Says who? Where are the eyewitnesses? Where are the audit trails of control and command? Or is this most serious, perhaps, of all the allegations, founded in truth on nothing more than untestable, multiple hearsay, centuries after the event, written in a different moral universe with its own agendas? Count 3. Alexander may indeed have permitted the enslavement of the women of Persepolis. It would have been considered, I suggest, very peculiar if he hadn't. And that's shocking to say for us now, but it was par for the course in 331 BC, as it had been in the Iliad, as it still was at Carthage 200 years later. And as for Count 4, I leave you in the hands of Miss Williamson, who will follow.
Members of the jury, when you are considering Count 4, the prosecution seek to persuade you that the burning of the palace amounts to a war crime. They argue that it was a continuation of the deliberate decision by Alexander to sack and destroy Persepolis. However, they concede that if the destruction of the palace was simply drunken behaviour, this would not amount to a war crime. The prosecution will only make you sure of guilt on Count 4 if they can satisfy you so that you are sure that the destruction of the palace was a deliberate political act. On behalf of Alexander the Great, we urge you to look carefully at the evidence, because we submit that a careful analysis of the evidence actually undermines the case the prosecution bring, even though my learned friend Mr. Goss argues it so eloquently. Firstly, the timing of the burning of the palace. We know from the main sources writing about this period that Alexander and his army entered the city of Persepolis either towards the end of December 331 BC or in January 330. If the burning of the palace was part of the decision to sack the city, then surely the destruction of the palace would have taken place at the same time as the sacking of the city, or very shortly after. But it was many months later that the palace was set alight. Plutarch tells us it was 4 months later. Why would there be such a delay? You may think that this is very persuasive evidence that it was not part of Alexander's plan. It was not part of the deliberate decision to sack Persepolis. Secondly, what does the evidence from the excavation show? The prosecution rely heavily upon the fact that there was an absence of major treasure when the site was excavated. However, small objects of gold and precious stone had been left on the floor of the palace. Surely if this was part of a deliberate decision to burn the palace, one that had been planned and thought through, absolutely nothing of value would have been left on the floor by Alexander's army. If this had always been part of the plan, then the soldiers would have collected up anything of value well in advance of the fire. Again, this suggests it wasn't planned. It was a spontaneous, drunken act. Thirdly, what was the reaction of Alexander's army? The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, in his History of Alexander the Great, tells us The army encamped not far from the city caught sight of the fire, thinking it was accidental, came running in a body to help. If the burning of the palace was a political act of deliberate destruction, then the army would have expected it. They wouldn't have thought it was accidental and come running to help put the fire out. Fourthly, why would Alexander deliberately plan to burn the palace when he had made significant arrangements demonstrating that Persepolis was still a place of importance? Its Persian governor was restored to his rank, and one of Alexander's men was appointed to a garrison of 3,000 Macedonians. The garrisoning of Persepolis was completely inconsistent with a deliberate, careful plan to burn the palace. Fifthly, and perhaps most importantly, the palace was now Alexander's own property that he'd won in battle. Why would he plan to deliberately destroy this, especially when doing so would lead the Persians to view him as a foreign barbarian? Alexander wanted and needed to persuade the Persians that he was their lawful king. He wanted to be accepted as a ruler, not as a barbarian destroyer. This was essential if he was to exploit his conquests and avoid a succession of wars of independence that would make his conquests permanently insecure. He needed a broad basis of support from the elite ruling class to give him that legitimacy. He didn't want to permanently antagonize those who he most needed to conciliate. By the spring of 331 BC, having spent 4 months in the city and having sent a sizable contingent of his Macedonians and other Greek veterans home following the arrival of reinforcements, Alexander's policies had developed, and he was no longer seeking to represent himself as the liberator of those oppressed by Persian rule. By this time, he wasn't simply proclaiming the end of the Archimedes rule. He was proclaiming its continuation and making it clear that he had taken it over. The prosecution's whole argument on count 4 overlooks what Alexander was trying to achieve at this stage of his campaign. During his stay at Susa and Persepolis, Alexander had sat on the ceremonial throne of the Archimedes kings. The man who had done that would not then deliberately destroy this revered palace complex as part of some deliberate political act. And of course, this also fits with our first point as to the delay between arriving in Persepolis and the burning of the palace many months later. Because what fell in that 4-month period was the Persian New Year festival. And it could be held in the palaces, the temples, and the halls. That was how he could gain support and legitimacy from the elite class that he needed to get on side. There are numerous examples of Alexander's conduct which show that he did not intend to disestablish the royal family and the leading statesmen of Persia. He was respectful to Darius's mother. When the wife of Darius died, he gave her a lavish funeral. He arranged for the education of Darius's son. The tomb of Persia's national hero, Cyrus the Great, at Persepolis, was restored on the order of Alexander. He appointed Persians as governors in the defeated areas of Susian and Persis, which showed that Persia was to be a self-governing state within Alexander's kingdom of Asia, no less than Egypt and Babylon. Even more remarkable was his appointment of Persians as governors of Babylonia, Armenia and Carmania on their liberation from Persian rule. This could only mean that he intended Persians should participate in the administration of his kingdom. And he chose to implement this policy when Darius was still at war and in command of an army in Media. This was a really enlightened policy towards a defeated state. It was long-sighted. It would have been completely counterproductive to deliberately burn the palace complex as a political act, undermining everything he had been doing to gain the acceptance of the Persian ruling class. So those are 5 points we say completely undermines the prosecution case. Now, the prosecution attempt to boost their case by relying on bad character evidence. Always a last resort of prosecutors who know they don't have sufficient evidence to prove their charges. They know that the answer is obvious. This wasn't a deliberate decision by Alexander. It occurred spontaneously at the end of a drunken banquet following the suggestion of Thais, the famous courtesan. This account comes from...
I have to ask you to keep it fairly brief now, please.
They try to undermine Clitarchus by slurring him as a tabloid source and seek to rely on Arrian, who they at least have the good grace to accept was writing 500 years later. Arrian, of course, was basing himself on Ptolemy and Aristobulus. And, of course, Ptolemy had a significant vested interest. He and Thais were lovers. We know from an inscription that they went on to have a child together, who was the winner of a horse chariot race in Greece. Although he went on to marry for political reasons, she was a mistress not to be forgotten. It would be better for both Thais and Ptolemy if she was not named in the events, in accounts of these events. Ptolemy would not want the mother of his children named in connection with acts of vandalism, which Alexander himself regretted. That is why Ptolemy admits all mention of Thais in his account, and Arrian has adopted this version without properly questioning Ptolemy's motives. How can you as a jury safely rely upon that evidence? Members of the jury, the historian Arrian himself admits that the possibility of ever knowing what actually prompted the burning of Persepolis may never be known. If that was the view of Arrian, and we know historians continue to disagree about the reasons why the palace was burnt, how can the prosecution make you sure that it was a deliberate political act that should be punished as a war crime? They cannot. And that is why we invite you to return a not guilty verdict on count 4 and also on counts 1 to 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, members of the jury, you have heard the cases put forward now on behalf of the prosecution and the defence. All that remains is for me to sum up the case to you shortly before you're asked to give your verdicts. You will recall that the indictment contains 4 counts. You must consider each count separately and return a separate verdict on each count. As at any criminal trial, it's not for the defendant to have to prove to you that he's innocent of the crimes of which he's accused. It is the prosecution who must prove their case. So on each count, you must convict the defendant only if the prosecution have made you sure of the defendant's guilt. If you're left unsure, your verdict must be not guilty. Now, in an ordinary criminal trial, it would be for me to direct you as to the substantive law that you must apply. But as you will have realised by now, this is no ordinary criminal trial, and it will be for you, members of the jury, to exercise your judgment as to what are the legal standards by which you think it right that the defendant should be judged. So far as the facts are concerned, the prosecution have been put to proof of the facts alleged on all 4 counts. But you may think, members of the jury, although it's entirely a matter for you, that there is some difference in this respect between counts 1, 2, and 3 and count 4, because it's only on count 4 that it is suggested that there is a divergence in the historical sources. There has been no suggestion, although Mr. Gibbs reminded you that the evidence relied on is hearsay evidence, that there's been no suggestion of any divergence of accounts as to the facts alleged on counts 1, 2, and 3. Now, you may think it indubitable, members of the jury, and I do not understand it to have been disputed by the defence, that if the facts alleged on any of the, or each of the 4 counts are proved, they constitute war crimes judged by the standards of modern international humanitarian law. So far as the ancient standards are concerned, the prosecution have sought to persuade you as an alternative argument that even by the standards of the time, Alexander's acts constituted war crimes. But when considering that submission, members of the jury, you will want to bear carefully in mind the references that the defence made to Homer's Iliad and the values which that reflects. You may conclude, members of the jury, though it is a matter, as I emphasise again for you, that the fundamental issue raised by this trial is essentially a philosophical issue, and that may be appropriate in a case that derives from the Greek civilization, which either invented or discovered philosophy, depending on your point of view. And the philosophical issue is one about whether the fundamental moral norms that are appealed to by the prosecution are relative in historical terms, or whether they are absolute standards. And you will have to consider, on the one hand, whether you accept the contention put forward by the prosecution that the acts, if you find them proved, violate universal values, which, even if not recognized in the year 331 BCE, should be seen as timeless. Or do you consider, as the defence invite you to conclude, that to convict the defendant would be to commit a fallacy of anachronism? That is a question for you, members of the jury. On count 4, as you will appreciate, the position stands differently, as there is an initial question which arises as to whether you are satisfied, so that you are sure that the destruction of the palace complex was a deliberate political act. If you are not satisfied of that, then it is accepted by the prosecution that you must find the defendant not guilty on count 4, whatever historical standards are applied. If, however, you are satisfied that the destruction of the palace was a deliberate political act, then you will need to consider again the question of whether the values and standards by which Alexander should be judged are timeless standards which we now recognize today, or different standards that applied in his own times. So, contrary to normal practice, members of the jury, you will be given no opportunity to deliberate amongst yourselves at this trial, and there will be no requirement to attempt to reach unanimous verdicts. I will accept immediate majority verdicts, which will be taken by a show of hands. So I will now ask, or is it for me to do? Perhaps is it for me to take the verdicts? Oh, good. I'm glad. I wasn't sure whether we had a clerk of the court.
No. I'm, amongst other things, the jury bailiff.
Oh.
I shall now take the verdict.
Right. Well, in that case, I will ask now the jury bailiff to read each count to you in turn, and for you, the members of the jury, to indicate by a show of hands whether on that count you find the defendant not guilty or guilty as charged.
Right, members of the jury, count 1 charges Alexander that he ordered the extensive pillaging and or destruction by the Macedonian army of the city of Persepolis, which was not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly in violation of the laws and customs of war. If you regard him as guilty, please raise your hand. Can I have some help counting? I'll count this section here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in that section. How many in the middle section? 6 on the left-hand bank, 10 there, and in the middle? Right, so 16 for guilty, and those who think not guilty, please raise a hand. Or a very large number. So the verdict on count 1 is not guilty. Count 2 charges Alexander that he ordered the willful killing en masse by the Macedonian army of those Persian civilians present in the city of Persepolis. How many consider Alexander guilty on count 2? Please raise your hand if you do. 1, 2, 2 over there.
11.
Right, so that's 13 in all, and not guilty? A huge majority. Thank you very much. Count 3, Alexander ordered or permitted the enslavement en masse by the Macedonian army of female Persian civilians present in the city of Persepolis. Votes for guilty? 2, 4, 5 on this section. How many there?
13.
Right, so that's 18. And how many for not guilty? Not quite such a large majority, but I think it is a majority. Perhaps we need to count.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you very much. And count 4, he ordered or permitted the destruction of the palace complex, a historic monument, when this was not imperatively demanded by the necessities of war and was not a military objective. Votes for guilty? 3 here. How many?
5.
So that's 8 for guilty and not guilty? An enormous majority. Well, as jury bailiff will have jury report,
yes.
I can record that the verdict is not guilty on all counts.
Well, I will have to discharge you, Alexander. It's not the custom anymore for judges to regret the verdict of the jury. But I cannot help feel some regret that in this case, you, the jury, have found that the deliberate extermination and enslavement of innocent civilians by the defendant are not culpable as war crimes. Nevertheless, so be it.
Right. Well, may I now thank all 4 counsel for their excellent submissions in this case. Of research and put it to good use, so I hope you've enjoyed and been informed by their submissions. Secondly, the learned judge. May I thank Lord Leggatt as well, who has obviously himself put a lot of time into preparing for this role this evening. So thank you very much for... As you know, this event is organised by Classics for All. It's one of the many events which we do over the years, not just Moots in this court, but other events as well. So if you want to join the lawyers group of Classics for All, you're either a lawyer or somewhere in the legal world, you'll be most welcome to do so. As you know, Classics for All promotes and funds the teaching of classics in state schools, especially in areas of social deprivation, and has reached a huge number of primary and secondary schools over the years. To tell you a little bit more about the work of Classics for All, we shall now hear briefly from a teacher at Hempstead School called Harley Aston, who I think will come forward together with Hilary Hodgson, the Chief Executive of Classics for All. Just tell us a little about it.
I think this one's nice and high. We're quite tall as well, so I'm going with this one. I'll go for the short one then. We can stand here actually. We're probably okay on that one. I think most of you are familiar with Classics for All. I mean, its sole purpose is to increase the teaching of classics in state schools and stem the decline over the years. There's a big disparity between the amount of classics taught in the independent sector and the state sector. Since we first started 10 years ago on our impossible mission, we have worked with 1,200 schools, trained 5,000 teachers, largely non-specialists, to teach classics in the state system. And I think that's an incredible achievement with a staff of about 5 and regional coordinators across the country. And why do we do this? For some of the reasons outlined tonight. It's a noble discipline, it's rich, it's wide, it breaks down barriers, it stimulates the imagination. And a lot of our young people are now so motivated by learning classics that they are going on to Oxford and Cambridge and studying classics there. And 10 years ago, they wouldn't have been in that position. We survive on a shoestring. We raise funding, year by year to continue what we're doing. And Harley Aston, who's here with me tonight, is an aspiring head of classics.
Yes.
And you'll find out in a minute why. Who works at Hemel Hempstead School in Hertfordshire, which is a large comprehensive school. So Harley, you moved to Hemel in 2000. Did the school have any classics when you went there?
No, when I first started teaching, there was no classics at the school at all.
Yeah, so what motivated you? Are you a classicist yourself?
I have a degree in archaeology, but my background, I didn't have any exposure to classics, unfortunately, until I reached my A-levels, because I wasn't considered smart enough to be allowed to study Latin when I first started secondary school, so I didn't get a place in the class. Boo, yes. So when I had the opportunity to study at A-level, I took it on a whim and ended up loving it so much that I knew that as I went forward in my teaching career, I wanted to offer the same opportunities to learn it to students that I would be teaching.
So with your archaeology degree, what were you teaching to start with?
I was a history teacher. I'm a trained history teacher.
Right.
Yeah. So lots of Nazis and Cold War lessons.
Nazi and Cold War, and not as rich as the Iliad or Homer or anything?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, so you moved schools. I gather you failed in your first school to persuade the head to do classics. So you moved to Hemel. And miraculously, after 3 months, you managed to introduce ancient history A-level. How the heck did you do that? What powers of persuasion have you got, and why is it important?
Dogged persistence.
Right.
I approached the head of our sixth form. I asked if it was something I could offer at the open day, and if there was enough interest, would I be allowed to set it up? I got lots of ums and ahs, and then as soon as I mentioned that Classics for All would be willing to help us with grants and training, suddenly leadership ears perked up, and I was allowed to pursue interests. And now we've been running it for 3 years now.
How many pupils have you got at A-level?
So currently studying at A-level, we have around, I think it's between around 16, 17 students at A-level. We've just had one class go through as well, so I think we've totaled about 25 students that have studied.
Have some gone on to university?
Yes. We've had one student go on to study archaeology at Bournemouth University. We currently have 2 year 13s that are looking to pursue it as well at university level, and we have a couple of year 12s who just within the last few months are now starting to think that it's what they would like to pursue.
But your achievements don't stop there, because I think you've done a little more than that. What else have you persuaded the senior management team to do?
Again, I did say to my head teacher, next it will be GCSE, and he sort of gave me a raised eyebrow, but I have this September introduced GCSE Classical Civilization. I had over 50 students apply to study it for the first time. I have a class of 32 students, and they're all so enthusiastic, and they absolutely adore every lesson. And we have a classics club as well for lower down, so years 7, 8 and 9, and we started looking at Latin as well as looking at ancient artwork, studying parts and extracts from the Iliad as well during their lunchtimes. And
what would perhaps the most excited students say about the benefits of learning classics for the first time? Any good anecdotes?
I think so many of them are just so enthusiastic about it. They're going away reading books about it, they're watching TV shows, they're coming to me with so many different questions that it's really broadening their horizons and really thinking about what is open to them. One of the students I brought along today studies politics alongside ancient history, and he said that it helps it to make so much more sense how relevant ancient history is, despite how long ago it was, to our modern day, whether it's through politics, history, or any other subjects that they're studying.
I think as one of our learned friends says earlier, it was as relevant then as it is now.
Exactly, I couldn't have said that myself.
Yes, so perhaps we'll quote them. I think, and it's fantastic. Now, one last thing, because people are busting for a drink.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And we've probably said enough. And 4 of the students are here, so you can quiz them yourselves afterwards. They're on the front row and they all look reasonably presentable. And I'm very glad, by the way, that you didn't put Alexander away, because he's my grants and training manager at CFA, and we're rather short-staffed at the moment. So, Harley, in a couple of words, how has CFA been helpful? Are we good at our job?
It would not have been possible to do this without your help and support at all. I wouldn't have been able to do this, and the students wouldn't be able to be studying it, so I'm eternally grateful.
Yeah, and it doesn't cost that much, because we're good bang for buck. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Back again. I forgot the most important bit. Before I hand back to Rupert to wind down the evening and say a few closing remarks, it would be entirely remiss of me not to mention that he is standing down as the chair of the lawyers group after 4 years, and he has also organised all of the wonderful Moot trials and mock trials that we've staged over the years with tremendous grace, style, dexterity, clarity and aplomb. And we are really, really grateful to you, Richard, and many thanks. Big round of applause. Hello to Sir Rabinder Singh. Would you stand for me, Rabinder? Who has, probably foolishly, agreed to take over the reins of the lawyers group, and I think will do an equally brilliant job. Welcome.
Well, now that these proceedings are coming to a close, I've already thanked counsel and the judge, and obviously we're very grateful to them. I also thank Harley for coming to tell us about her experience as a teacher supported by Classics for All. And her story is one which comes from many schools around the country. Classics for All is an invaluable charity which well, as you can see, achieves real results. If any of you feel moved to make donations, please go onto the Classics for All website, and there may even be a machine outside which will enable you to make donations this evening. If there's anyone here in the legal world or a member of the legal profession who's not yet a member of the lawyers group, please join us. You will be able to come to events such as this for a modest subscription. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I shall now close these proceedings, and if you go outside, refreshments will be served. Thank you all very much.